of you probably have questions, but I'm going to begin myself by posing a question to both Leo and Dimitri. And that is, Leo, on one hand, you had said that in the Syriza leadership, Europeanness is in their DNA. And yet, you see the Syriza leadership advising people to vote no for the proposal on the table. So some comments on reconciling that. And I think as well, Dimitri, you agree with Leo in that sense that the leadership of Syriza does not want to leave the European Union. They're faced with this crisis in terms of the euro as a currency. So my question is if you could address that point. And also, some people have referred to the fact that it is all in the wording, how you phrase the referendum, how people will be voting. And Leo just cited the polls that were conducted this evening, but how you think and anticipate how the referendum will be phrased and how the people will respond to it.
Well, I think the question that's been put to them is there's a the part of the question is the offer. I don't think I've ever seen a referendum like this. There's something like an 11 or 15-page offer, whatever. It's highly technical language, setting forth the terms demanded by the Troika, and they actually make that part of the question, and they simply ask, do you want us to say yes to this or no? In any referendum, the way you formulate the question is key. And there are drawbacks and advantages to any particular formulation depending upon what your agenda may be. The drawback to this particular formulation, I think it may be obvious to a lot of you, is that people may want to remain in the Eurozone at any cost, but they may be under the impression that if they say no, there will be a resumption of negotiations, and that would lead to an improved offer from the Troika. That assumption may be erroneous, and based on everything that the leaders of Europe are saying, it is erroneous. They're saying, effectively, we're not going to return to negotiations. We're going to expel you from the Eurozone, even though there's no legal basis for them to do that. So there's no perfect question to be asked. I think it's a very precise question. I would prefer that they put to them the question that Tariq Ali recently suggested in an op-ed published in the major newspaper. Do you want to remain in the Eurozone at any cost? Because it seems to me that that's effectively what they're being asked to do. They're being, or demanded of them. It's being demanded that they remain in the Eurozone, even if that means a grinding, punishing depression for years to come, a lost generation, possibly 2 lost generations, massive emigration of the youth from the country. And really that's the question that should be put to them. But however you slice and dice it, there are going to be advantages and disadvantages to whatever question you select. Assuming that the answer to this question is ultimately yes, and so the Greek people, the majority of the Greek people want the government to accept the offer, I share Leo's view that this is far from over, because what will then happen is the Germans and others, the German government and other leaders of the Eurozone are going to say, we have absolutely no confidence in Syriza to implement this program. You've bitterly condemned the Troika's offer. You've passionately urged the population to reject it. We already have questions about the willingness of the Greek government to implement the demands of the institutions. Why would we believe that you would do that? So it seems to me that if there is a yes vote, it's almost certainly going to precipitate an election. The election, of course, will take some weeks to fight. How do you keep the Greek banking system alive during that period of time? What is going to happen to the population as they continue to endure these quite severe capital controls? And what if the population says at the end of the day, okay, look, we said we wanted our government to accept this offer, but we don't want any other government to implement it. We want Syriza to implement it, because Syriza will implement it in a way that is relatively humane. Whereas the New Democracy Party, the right-wing party in the country that was governing previously, might do it in a way that's rather inhumane. And what will then transpire if there is an election and the Greek people, after saying yes to the ultimatum, say no to the replacement of Syriza? This is a mess, and it's a grand mess that the Eurozone has created, and I don't think there's going to be any clean solution no matter what the result of that vote is.
Um, Dimitri sent to us the day the referendum was announced a little note that said the word they're using for no, which is ahi, is different than may. Yes. And because it has a very different historical meaning. In Greece, it was the word that was used to mobilize against the Italian fascists in 1940. So it has a very great resonance, and you know, people will be voting in relation to, as is constantly reminded them, did today in this big long television speech he made, about dignity. And this matters a lot to a country that's been occupied and fought a civil war, etc. And in which a large part of the population very proudly, in a way, thinks that the losers of the Civil War have achieved retribution with the election of this government. So there's an element of national pride here. And it's ironic that, you know, it's led by people who are committed internationalists who want to stay with Europe. And that's admirable, as well as contradictory. Their position is that there's no legal basis for Greece to be kicked out of Europe. That there's no treaty provisions, there's no laws that allow them to be kicked out. I was asking Dimitri this, maybe he knows this much better than I, and he says that that's right. There are procedures for how a country can leave the European Union, but there are no procedures for leaving the Eurozone. It seems to be a common currency, no procedures. So the notion that they're going to get kicked out might involve a challenge to the European Court of Justice, and it's unclear how they would rule. But if you talk to anybody in the senior position in Syriza, they will always say this. They can't kick us out. There's no legal basis to kick us out. We will simply refuse to do what they're asking, right? And you know, they don't have an answer then for what will happen then, but that's their position. And it is possible that if they do get a no vote, with pressure from the Americans who have geostrategic concerns and are much more concerned than the Germans about being responsible for containing financial crisis, it is possible that they get a better deal. It's still possible. Right? They may cover it over in all kinds of ways to save face. In fact, in order to prevent the small countries of Europe rejecting it, right? They put enough heat on them that they lie to their own populations and say, we didn't really do this with Greece, but they would. Right? The question is, how much would they do? And that's what's not clear. And if they don't do much, I just want to say this, what Dimitri was pointing with is really important. And that is, even if they get a no vote, not just a yes vote, I do think that the powers that be are working for a split in Syriza's leadership. They're looking for what I call the Ramsay-MacDonald solution. In 1921, a Labour government was elected in Britain. It was a minority government. And right at the beginning of the Depression, it held on to the gold standard, which was forced austerity in the context of the Depression. They were cutting relief benefits. And finally, the Labour Party said, we can't support this. And they formed the government, the leadership. Ramsay MacDonald and Snowden, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, formed a government with the Conservatives, a national unity government. And immediately they went off the gold standard. And Snowden, the finance minister, said, gee, nobody told me we could do that. So once they got rid of a radical government, they went through all kinds of things now to give them room for maneuver. And this is not an impossibility. There are some very, very pragmatic people in Syriza, not the people around Cyprus, who are really the old communists, who tend to be very pragmatic almost everywhere. You see the numbers of them that are social democrats in the West and in Eastern Europe, etc. And that's conceivable. That's something that could happen. But were there to be such a government, or were a technocrat's government formed again, this would lead to tremendous social disruption in Greece. This would not create stability. They're living under illusions if they think that they're going. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, you were talking about the scenario of the no vote. And the problem with the no vote, and I think this is what one of the things, maybe the thing that the Baltimore uprising, and other uprisings that have happened in the United States, as the extent of police brutality against the African American community has become clearer, what it shares in common with the Greece crisis, and that is that it's a class struggle that is being a war against the weaker classes, that it's been waged in the name of racism or by means of racism. And although the Greek population has not suffered anywhere near the level of racist vitriol that African Americans have suffered, there's this narrative which has been pummeled into the European population of the profligate Greek and the lazy Greek and the tax-cheating Greek and so forth. And I think that this invective has boxed the leadership of the Eurozone into a corner. Now, if they were to make very significant concessions, I don't know if they could get the program through their parliaments. They'd have to be approved by their parliaments. That could cause social unrest in their countries. So it's a very, very fragile, explosive situation, and whatever the vote may be, to go back to what I said previously, there's going to be a grand mess, and I don't know that these people are up to the task of cleaning up. And I'm talking about the leadership of the Troika and the Eurozone. And there's no political will within the Eurozone leadership to engage in that higher degree of political and economic integration. Heiner Flassbeck, who was interviewed by Paul on the Real News, a German economist, talked about this, and he described Greece as a sideshow. And although it's not to the Greek people a sideshow, from the bigger picture of the future of the Eurozone, it is. The much bigger question is, how is a country like France going to react when its populace is forced to engage in a vicious internal devaluation because it can't devalue the currency? When its government is forced to slash the wages of its workers, how are they going to react when they endure austerity or forced to endure austerity on the scale of the austerity forced upon the Greek population? They're not going to stand for it. And Marine Le Pen, the Front National leader, is standing in the wings waiting to take over, and she has an overtly hostile attitude towards the Euro and the Eurozone and the European Union, as a matter of fact. That is ultimately how this is all going to end up. And so from my perspective, whatever reasons there may be for the government to want to remain within the Eurozone, or hitching the lifeboat of Greece to the Euro Titanic, it's going to hit an iceberg very soon, it's going to sink, it's better to get out now, and in fact there may be a first mover advantage. The first country to get out may be able to do so with some assistance from the other states who are relatively stable at this point in time. They'll have an interest in giving some assistance to Greece because of its geopolitical significance. They're not going to want to see it fall within the orbit of Russia and China and so forth. But once the larger countries begin to break apart from the Eurozone, I think that Greece is just going to become an afterthought. They're not going to care one iota about facilitating the country's transition to the drachma. So I would urge them to take the opportunity to get out now while the getting's good.
There's one thing that I think is possible. I think that there's a portion of the managers of the European economy that think that the introduction of capital controls is a good way to keep Greece in. Looking at what happened in Cyprus, I think Schauble and others around him, by virtue of having capital controls, it means that the European Central Bank doesn't have to keep the Greek banks going. And they've always been above all concerned that the euro should not be devalued or you have a monetary policy that would have inflationary consequences. And they've been troubled by the European Central Bank providing liquidity to the Greek banks. And one of the reasons that the Americans have put pressure on the Europeans to do quantitative easing, that is, keep throwing liquidity to banks, buying back debt, etc., is in order to help resolve the Greek crisis. So, with capital controls may now stay on with an agreement. That's a conceivable outcome. That then would, however, raise contradiction in relation to the fundamental commitment to the free movement of capital. But they lived with the Chinese with this, let alone the Cypriots. So I think this is one possible thing you ought to be looking at. I think this shows the extent to which, as Charmy said, the crisis that began in 2007-8 and it led to the outbreak of the Eurozone crisis in late 2009, 2010. We are still very much in the continuing effects of that first great capitalist crisis of the 20th century. People forget that in 1937 there was a second downturn, even after all of the measures of the New Deal have been implemented in the United States. And I think that the powers that be are looking with some fear at a global level at not only continuing stagnation, which is now very clear in terms of the BRICS, the third world countries that everyone thought would continue booming, would be able to de-link from the United States, etc. On the contrary, they sit there with bated breath, fearful that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates and cause massive outflows of capital from their countries and cause currency crises and balance of payments crises in each of those countries. The irony is that it was China that lowered its interest rates last weekend when it had a meltdown in the stock market. So we're still in this crisis, and I think this is how it needs to be seen. Now, people are talking of a crisis of the Eurozone. Will this lead to an undoing of economic and monetary union and so on? And we'll have to see. I think it's not likely. But it's certainly showing the fragility of the way that was put together. And why capital controls in Greece are so significant and important is that this is the first time since the 97-98 Asian financial crisis that, apart from what happened in Cyprus and very temporarily in Iceland, which are much smaller little pockets in the world economy. This is the first time that an economy of any size, this is the ninth largest country, even though it's smaller than Ontario in population, the ninth largest population in the European Union. So for a very brief period, Malaysia, for over a year, instituted capital controls in the context of the 1997-98 Asian crisis. And the Americans were going crazy, worried that this was going to lead to a cascading capital controls, which would give governments again some room for maneuver in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. Of course, we would want to socialize those capital controls not only be about the flow of capital in and out of the country, we would want it to be about capital, the control of capital in terms of what gets invested inside the country, who invests, how it's invested, etc. So the people who run the global economy, above all the Treasury and Federal Reserve, are very worried about this. That said, they haven't been able to control the IMF, who have played an appalling role, and again they indicate the weakness of Obama and his administration in this respect. The Russophobia thing, I'm Russophobe, I have to tell you. I have no admiration. There's no good guys in this fight. And that's not to say I don't think that the Ukrainian fascists are horrific. Those people killed my family. But the Russian oligarchs are not somebody we should be looking to save our bacon. The authoritarian Putin is not someone we should be looking to save our bacon. That said, it would be perfectly understandable if the Greeks turn to Russia or China in the ways that you spoke to. But these are very long-run things. The Russians aren't in much of a situation to bail out Greece in terms of the size of the debt that they owe, and building that pipeline is a long way away. Or China, and this is why privatization is on the cards, wants to use the port of Piraeus as the way as a major entry port, like Long Beach, California, into Europe. And want to modernize that port, although they've already done so to some extent. So, China also would have an interest in doing that. But you need to see this in terms not of a break from the American empire, but further integration in it. Why do they want to build a pipeline through Greece? Why do the Chinese want to use Piraeus as a port? To continue their integration into global capitalism. So they have an interest in the resolution of the capitalist crisis. The BRICS are not anti-capitalist by any means, and China, although they have capital control, is moving more and more towards the liberalization of the renminbi as part of its integration of global capitalism. So I think we shouldn't be bringing the technicolor about what that means, apart from what it would mean, as it did for Cuba, to become dependent on an authoritarian regime. That had a big effect on Cuba when it became dependent on the authoritarian Communist Party. And this would be worse if we're talking about an authoritarian capitalist. So these are hard, not to say they might not have to rely on this, but these are hard choices. Why are they committed to staying in the Eurozone? Well, partly it's consumerism. It's partly having the range of choice that having gap and all the rest of that implies. Greece is not Cuba. There isn't a very large subordinate class like the Cuban peasants who were virtually able to live on subsistence. These are people who are Western consumers. They are committed for better reasons than that. They're committed because this is a country that had a military dictatorship between 67 and 74. And they see Europe as providing certain guarantees against another one. Maybe naively, but to some extent it does, because of the liberal democratic arrangements and the autonomy of the juridical system. I mean, I totally agree that the legal discourse that they engage in, they have no right to kick us out, etc. Of course, it's naive, but you have to see this in the way we use constitutional provisions around freedom of association. When we say, hey, they don't have the right to take away the right to strike. The Canadian Charter says that unions have freedom of association. So this is partly a mobilizing device. It's a discursive device to get support. They don't have the right to kick us out. I don't think how much they believe is another question, but it's the way that they argue in order to shift the balance of forces. I think the referendum on Scotland is not a good example. This is something entirely different. I mean, implicitly in the Scottish attempt to break with the United Kingdom is the notion that they would enter the European Union. So this is something very, very different.
I'm just going to add, as I thought Leo answered very comprehensively, and I agree with much of what he said, all of it actually. I'm just going to elaborate on this question of what happens if they leave the Eurozone and why do they want to do it. Expulsion or withdrawal from the monetary union would not affect the mobility of the Greeks. That's something that is part and parcel of the European Union. So they would have the same right to go and work in other parts of the Union, even if they were expelled or withdrew from the Eurozone. What they would lose is the ability to use the common currency. And that means that they would be able to travel to other parts of the Eurozone and other countries outside of the Eurozone less easily and frequently, because it would be, with a devalued currency, very prohibitively expensive for a lot of them to do that. And they wouldn't be able to buy goods as frequently, as often. They wouldn't be able to consume as many goods that are produced outside of the country because of the devalued currency. Those are really the disadvantages from an economic perspective. And then there's a psychological disadvantage, which is, and Kostas Lavavitsas, who's a Syriza MP from the left wing of the party, has talked about this. That when Greece became a member of the Eurozone, for the first time, Greeks really began to feel like they were part of Europe, and that meant a great deal to them. Whereas previously, they didn't really have an identity within the continent or within the culture of Europe, and it's difficult for them to let that go. But other than that, there are really no disadvantages to withdrawal from the Eurozone, and there are many advantages, one of which is that the all-critical tourist sector would become more competitive. Right now, people, when they go to Greece on vacation, they have to pay in euros. If they were paying, if Greece had a devalued drachma, the vacations for people from outside the country, people who come from the United States, Canada, Europe, would be much less expensive, and so it would be a much more attractive tourist destination. Products produced locally would become more competitive. The real problem is the wrenching adjustment from the euro to the drachma and the pain that that's going to inflict. I have said many times, on a long-term basis, I think the readoption of the drachma is in the national interest. It will restore Greek sovereignty. It will allow the economy to grow again. It will give the government the capacity to engage in progressive social and economic policies that it doesn't currently possess. But the transition is going to be extremely painful. And it's the fear of that transition right now which I think is holding back the populace. And I think also the leadership of Syriza has an additional concern, and their concern is that if, and Varoufakis has spoken about this extensively, they feel that if Greece leaves, there's likely to be a disintegration of the Eurozone, and what Europe will look like after that disintegration is much worse than what it currently looks like. All of the old resentments and hostilities will come to the surface. There'll be much less room for progressive economic and social policies across the Eurozone. So there are two types of debt that are owed. The first is that the Nazi government forced the central bank of Greece during the Second World War to lend it money. It was a loan, an offer that couldn't be refused. That debt has never been paid back, and with interest that's accumulated since then, it's now the debt currently amounts to somewhere between 10 and 15 billion euros. So you can imagine how it irks the Greek people to be told they're deadbeats when the German government has simply ignored that debt all of these years, and then on top of it, after the Second World War, requested and received a massive write-down of its own debt. To his credit, I believe it was the president of Germany acknowledged that this is a legitimate claim. But Angela Merkel and Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany, have done nothing to rectify this obvious injustice. The other type of debt, which is alleged to be owed, is that relating to war crimes and atrocities committed by the Nazi government. And they were quite horrific in Greece. Greece was one of the countries that put up the stiffest resistance. It was the left that did that. There were within Greek society right-wing collaborators with the Nazi government, as there were, for example, in France. The left, however, put up stiff resistance, and the population was collectively punished. Tens of thousands of people died in Athens alone from starvation. And there were massive retributions against the civilian population whenever there were attacks by the resistance fighters in the countryside as well. A commission was struck by the Greek parliament to estimate the debt, and it came out to be, I think, 200 to 300 billion euros, as I recall. The position of the German government is that at the time of the unification of Eastern and Western Germany, you didn't ask for it, therefore you forfeited your right to it. I can tell you that there's no legal basis whatsoever to that argument. It's nonsense. One can quibble with the amount and say that that's excessive or not sufficient, but the principle that Greece should receive reparations for those atrocities is, I think, unassailable from a moral perspective. I'll let Leo answer the other question.
The other question was on Chris Hedges and the opposition government.
Well, the KKE is a strange beast. It's kind of a ghetto, dogmatic, but also social, and it still has very deep roots in a portion of the Greek working class, and in a strong portion of the trade union. And I think that what they mainly are concerned with is protecting that base. You know, they look upon Syriza as not only, you know, ideologically suspect, they put it mildly, but, you know, as endangering that base. And they have circled the wagon around that base constantly. And I imagine that's what's going on now. You know, that's all I can imagine. It's appalling in many ways, I think, but that's what it's about. It is, you know, I think, you know, we said this year before, that the comparison with 1917 is very apt in the sense that, you know, Russia was the weakest link in 1917. And Lenin's position at a time of tremendous international instability of capitalism at that time thought that a revolution in Russia would kick off revolutions elsewhere. That didn't happen. That's one of the reasons why Russia was encircled and what eventually happened in the attempt to build socialism in one country. And what has been the case here is that while, you know, what's happened in Spain with the rise of Podemos is inspiring, and there's been movement in Scotland and Sinn Féin in Ireland and in Portugal as well, with United Left. In Northern Europe, where the strength really lies because of the balance of forces in Europe, what Ernie just called for is hardly visible. It's absolutely, not only have the Social Democrats, you know, been as hidebound in their austerity mentality, and in really their racist mentality, as Dimitri was describing. You know, speaking to their own working classes in this really virtual racist way. But there's been no mobilizations of any significant kind in the labor movements. I mean, where have been the massive demonstrations, right, to shift the balance of forces inside each of those countries? And Scandinavia has been as bad as Germany in terms of insisting on austerity. And this is supposed to be, you know, the great example of the social democratic Valhalla. So, you know, I don't think there's a revolutionary moment. I think Hedges it's wishful thinking.